So I'm Miwa Messer. I'm actually the host of Barnes & Noble's podcast, Poured Over, but we are not taping for the show tonight. We're actually taping for Barnes & Noble's YouTube because 3 years ago, I had the great grand pleasure of speaking with Bonnie Garmus before Lessons in Chemistry became a force of nature. And we were partially responsible for that. You may know that Lessons in Chemistry was a Barnes & Noble Book of the Year in 2022. Mm-hmm. And I'm still having a moment because my sense of time is a little squirrely. And when the opportunity to hang out with Bonnie came up, I said, yes, please. And then we were trying to figure out where. And then we figured out here. And I thought, wow, that would be really cool because I've never been able to tape in that store yet. We do a lot of taping in New York. We do a lot of taping in Los Angeles. And I was like, let's go to New Jersey. And I'm very happy to see all of you. So this is where I remind you, we are taping. The backs of your heads will be used. I do like to work in your questions as we go, because I don't like to hold questions until the very end. And when we're taping, it's actually a little distracting to have a mic and then, have people get up and all of that kind of stuff. So if you have not handed in a question, you can still do it. So we will have folks walking around, so if you want to just raise your hand, we can get you an index card. I hope you have a pen. I'm not handing over my pencil. Sorry. But we're happy to keep questions going. You may notice some overlap between questions that I have and that you have, so I may not repeat a question. But I really like to have your participation, and I like to hear from the audience if there's... Sometimes my jokes land, and sometimes they land really well, and sometimes feel free to roll your eyes. It's okay. I have a younger brother. It's fine. I understand these things. But more importantly, we get to hang out with Bonnie Garmus tonight. So now I'm going to say some fancy things about Bonnie and get the show on the road, but I just wanted to talk to you guys before we started this so that you know that you're part of this as well, because honestly, taping in front of a live audience is really fun. It's really fun. I like doing it. More importantly, Bonnie Garmus, mega best-selling author of Lessons in Chemistry, one of my favorite humans on the planet, because honestly, those of you who've experienced Elizabeth Zott, how many? Okay. If you haven't read the book, do not fear, I don't do spoilers, because you guys should get to experience Elizabeth and her gang of merry pranksters. And maybe not so merry pranksters, some of them. But how has it been for you? I mean, 3 years of nonstop touring, 3 years of Elizabeth Zott and Apple TV, and everyone kind of knows who you are now. It was not quite the same when you and I spoke the first time, where it's like, I really love your book. This is great.
I think more people know my husband. He's a Jeopardy champion.
Okay. All right.
Seriously, we were walking through an airport over the summer, and his episodes had just aired, and people were going, "It's the Jeopardy guy," and then when I had a book signing, they asked him to sign too.
I might be the only person who doesn't currently watch Jeopardy. So sorry.
Get out, Mia.
So sorry. So sorry. Hey, listen, I have a job. I have a job to talk about books. I mean, listen, if I'm watching something on a screen, it means I have maybe hit a wall and I can't. Does anyone else get to that point where you're just kind of like, I can't really read for a minute and I need to watch a thing instead? Okay, I'm seeing heads nod. Okay. So it's not just me.
Okay.
I was so excited, though. This is the third time I've read Lessons in Chemistry, and I was so happy to dip back in and feel like I knew this world. I was delighted to see Elizabeth and Mad. And Harriet, actually, I had a new response to Harriet. And I'm leaving out some of the men because we were walking around some stuff. But those women, or two women and a little girl, I was so happy to see them again.
Oh, thank you.
How does it feel for you, though, when you're doing events and you're suddenly plunged back in? I mean, have you ever really left, Elizabeth?
I mean, she hasn't left me.
Okay.
She talks to me frequently. But yeah, I mean, I'm trying actually to leave her so I can move on to this other book. But no, the characters are still with me, and I don't read my book again. I'm afraid because if I read it, I'll go, oh God, should have changed this, and this. I did read one time. The last time I read out loud at an event, I always read everything I write out loud, and I was reading out loud. They asked me to do a little piece, so I read it out loud. But when I read out loud, I edit. So I'm reading out loud, and I'm changing the words. And this woman in the front row says, "That's not what my book says." She was pissed.
I mean, I'm happy to hear she was attached to the words because the sentences are really great. And I don't like to sacrifice sentences for story. I'm a little picky that way. So when I get great sentences too, I'm very, very happy. Chemistry has changed, right?
I know. See, that's the thing.
Chemistry has changed. I don't. Yeah, that's a really great line. But we need to start with the chemistry because you are not a chemist. You started as an ad woman, which I love.
Yeah. Oh, thank you.
Because it's true, ad people can do lots of things. You know, Salman Rushdie actually started as a copywriter.
As did Joseph Heller, Kurt Vonnegut, and James Patterson, and Helen Gurley Brown. And it's a bunch of wannabe novelists sitting in ad agencies, I think. But yeah, that's how I started.
But chemistry.
Yeah, chemistry. So I knew that I had to make Elizabeth Zott a chemist because I knew I had to put her on television so she could spread her message. But the debate was, you know, what kind of show would a woman at that time have? And I settled on cooking because even I knew that cooking is chemistry. And so I thought, okay, well, I'll make her a chemist, you know, in my sort of naive way. I'll just make her a chemist. Because in copywriting, you never, ever write what you know. I thought, how hard can it be? Well, huge mistake. It was really hard. I got a book off of eBay from the 50s, a chemistry book, and I taught myself chemistry. And it was absolutely revolting. But and I made a lot of mistakes, and I live in London, and the fire brigade came, not once, but twice, due to the size of the flames that my neighbors noted from across the street. Yeah, oh no, it was pretty bad. The second time, by the way, the same crew came twice. And the second time the crew came, my chemistry lab book was sitting out on the counter, and he said, "Oh, Mom, you're not doing experiments in this kitchen, are you?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "You shouldn't do that." And I said, "But we're renters." And he goes, "Oh, okay." Anyway, they were just great, but they did give me a fire extinguisher on the second visit.
Okay. I'm glad. I'm very, very glad to hear that.
Me too.
I want to go back to the cooking show for a second because one of the things that I love about Lessons in Chemistry is this idea that you've captured a piece of monoculture, right? Remember when everyone watched sort of the same shows and like there was appointment television and you couldn't necessarily put your favorite show on your phone? It's really I spend a lot of time on planes, and actually I can't spy on what people are reading anymore because they're not holding physical books for the most part. They are watching a lot of weird stuff on their phones. Yeah. And I'm like, I'm sorry, I could use the Wi-Fi to answer my email, please.
Yeah.
But this idea that Elizabeth is in a moment where she can actually impact culture in ways that she wasn't necessarily expecting to.
Yeah, I mean, that was my hope with her, was that she would have this television show, and she would start at a small scale, and she would talk to the local populace, because at first the show was only shown locally, and then it was picked up nationally, and so she's able to spread her message, which, really had, people always say, "Oh, I'd love to get the recipes in the book," and I said, she barely cooks anything. She's really just spouting off about chemistry. But yeah, I mean, I really wanted to have this show and have that, like you say, a monoculture, because in fact, that's how I grew up. Exactly right. There was one show that you watched. And I think with Elizabeth Zott, she actually addresses the children at the end of every show. Children, go set the table. Your mother needs a moment to herself. And I remember somebody asked me about why that was her parting line. And I said, because Elizabeth Zott is educating the next generation that their mothers are important people, that they deserve their respect. And only Elizabeth Zott would assume that the children are going to watch the television too, watch it with them. And in fact, that's how I grew up. So
it's not quite Mad Men. I mean, I have to say, there's more. Elizabeth is not necessarily what I would call a people person.
No, she's not.
And I love her for that.
Oh,
but
well,
she's not really a people person.
No.
So the idea that she is, when she's on set, aware of what is happening around her. I mean, you've got this great sort of setup where Elizabeth and Mad, her daughter, are teaching each other sort of how to be people in the world. And Elizabeth's learning almost as much from her tiny person as her tiny person is learning from Mom. And watching this relationship develop. Because also Mad, I want to be clear, Mad is not a 40-year-old in a 4-year-old's body. Like, she's just a very smart child who is used to being around adults.
Yeah.
And it happens, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
So you've given Elizabeth this extra piece. You've given her this kid. You've given her this sort of EQ that happens around tiny people, but only tiny people. Yeah,
and my purpose with this, you mentioned Harriet as well. There was a triad of women. Mm-hmm. There is we have Mad at the low end, but then we have Harriet, who never got to go to school. She's not well educated. She has very old-fashioned ideas about culture. Then we have Elizabeth, who's very well educated, but self-educated. Harriet is a very straight Catholic, and Elizabeth Zott is an atheist, and then there's Mad. And so I wanted to have these three women come together and learn from each other. And for me, it was really important that Elizabeth is basically raising her child without limits, because she really wants to see what someone can become if they're not held back from anything.
Historical fiction can be tricky. And there are moments where you get pulled out of a story, right? Because someone just drops in a detail where you're like, yeah, that's not. And I never felt that way with Lessons in Chemistry, but I do want to talk to you about why you chose to write a novel set in the 50s and 60s, outside of the monoculture, because you do put Elizabeth through it. Yeah. She has some choices and some ideas that not everyone in her peer group would understand. And really, I refer again to the pencil. And for those of you who know what I'm talking about, the rest of you will find out soon enough. But why? I mean, why go back in time? What couldn't you do telling this story in the present day? I mean...
Well, when I started the book, the book started after a really bad day at work. Mm-hmm. I was in a pretty bad mood that day, and that day was the day I wrote the first chapter of Lessons in Chemistry, because on that day, I wanted reassurance that we had moved forward as women in the world from the 50s. I had recently reread, not The Second Sex, Betty Friedan's book.
Why am I blanking on the title?
Feminine Mystique.
Right.
I had recently reread that, and I didn't know at that time, until I reread it, that the 50s, the 40s and 50s, but especially the 50s, were among the most depressed women of the United States in that culture. It was the worst time for them. It was right after the war, and everybody said your life is easy and you have appliances and you're going to stay home and take care of the kids. And they were miserable. Mm-hmm. They were absolutely miserable. Mm-hmm. So, and they all had to stay home. So I started doing research, and I realized that back then, in the 50s, a woman couldn't be pregnant and work. She would lose her job. You got fired for being mm-hmm. pregnant. She didn't have her name on the deed of the house. She didn't have a bank account at all. Her husband had it. If she wrote a check, he had to co-sign it. I mean, the level of control was just unbelievable. And then, this is going to sound really ridiculous, but I was about halfway through the book, and I realized, shit, that's my mom's generation. Mm-hmm. This is how I grew up. Mm-hmm. And I didn't really remember so much because I was Mad's age in this book. But I was just really amazed to find out how many controls there were for women, what they could and couldn't do. You could be one of three things. You could be a nurse or a teacher or a mom. And that was it. And my mom... It's actually a little bit in the book. And if any of you have read it, there is one scene, I won't give anything away, where a woman says, I want to be a surgeon. Mm-hmm. Well, my mom should have been a surgeon. And she was held back from that. And I think I had a wonderful dad. He wasn't horrible or anything like that. But the idea back then was that all the women stayed at home. And in my neighborhood, I used to grow up thinking, why are the moms always in a bad mood? Mm. They all had 1,000 children. We all ran wild through the neighborhood, I saw a bunch of them recently, and it was just like, we were all like, wow, how did our moms do that? They used to ring bells for us to come home or scream across the streets and things. And then our fathers, my father traveled all the time, but the rest of the fathers would come home from work, and the first thing was the wife would have to go get them something to drink or make sure the table was ready and set and everything. And it just seemed like, even at a young age, I thought, this doesn't feel right. And it was no surprise to me that every woman in the neighborhood grew up to be a feminist. Every single one of us.
Some of us also don't believe in marriage except for other people. Just saying.
Yeah.
25 years in, I still don't believe in marriage, and he's still okay with it. But yeah, live your lives, people.
Yeah.
Stability and structure, though. Chemistry is stability and structure.
Yeah.
And I want to talk about the structure of the novel for a second, because you do a lot of cool things in the book. We have chapter titles, which we don't often get in a novel like this. We get incredible narrative pacing. I mean, this story moves, right? Like, it never slows down. And I love that, because I get great sentences and good characters while it does not slow down. But let's talk about the structure, because you'd been working on this sort of as you had a day job and as wasn't there a class that you took online through the company that
my
ended up being
daughter,
your agent?
yeah, my daughter, we've been transferred abroad. We were living in Switzerland, and then we were transferred to London, and I was pretty depressed about that. I was really depressed to have to start over again, make all new friends, blah, blah, blah. And I had written 3/4 of this novel in Zurich, and then I hit a wall, and I couldn't write it anymore, and I didn't know what was going to happen next, and I didn't care. It was bad. And my daughter, who's also here tonight, she said, there's this course online from this place called Curtis Brown. It's called Finish Right to the End of Your Novel. You should take that course. So I did, and I failed it because I did not write to the end of my novel. So that wasn't such a great, it says a lot about me. I will say nobody in the class wrote to the end of their novels, but I ended up meeting my agent through this agency. And I ended up taking an in-person class at their place. I went because I knew no one in London, and my husband was traveling all the time, and so I went and I got to meet 14 other writers, and we're still really close friends to this day. Okay.
When did we get to lessons in chemistry after, was it the in-person writing class where we finished the novel, or?
Yeah, that's okay. I actually didn't finish it then either. Actually, what happened was, so my agent at that time, this is an embarrassing story. I do really good research, I swear to you, but the one thing I don't research really are people. And I knew about this agent, Felicity Blunt, because I'd seen her on a YouTube video, and she said these amazing things, and I thought, wow, if I ever am lucky enough to have an agent, she would be just incredible. Well, she was at Curtis Brown, and they had this party for us after we all finished this class. The class was only 3 months, one night a week. It wasn't this big deal. But after the class, or rather at the party, Felicity Blunt walked in, and she said, she started handing out name tags for everybody and calling everyone's name, and there were like 60 of us. And then she called out my name, and I went to get my name tag from her, and she put all the name tags down. She said, "You need to come with me." And she took me by the elbow, and I went, "Oh my God, did I not pay for the class?" Or, and so she started talking about, she said, "I really like what I've read of your book." And I thought she had the wrong person. I literally did, because I knew her as somebody who was signing thrillers and things, and I thought, well, I certainly haven't written a thriller. And about 5 minutes in, she said, "Elizabeth Zott," and I went, "Oh, you mean my book?" So she's really impressed with me from the get-go. But no, that's where I met her, and she said, "Is the book done?" And I said, "No, it's not done." And she said, "When will it be done?" And so I lied, and I said, "June." I just made it up. And she goes, "Great, well, all right, well, then we'll be in touch." And then she called me in April, and she said, "Is it done yet?" And I went, "June." But she said, "I want you to come in my office and talk." And so I said, "Okay," and I mean, she's really just the most amazing person. She's just absolutely wonderful. But I was scared to death. And I go in there, and I don't do research on people very well. And she starts talking about the book, and she starts talking about, oh, wouldn't it be amazing if it was on television? Oh, her husband's an actor. And I said, oh, well, would he have been in anything that I would have seen? She's married to Stanley Tucci. It was mortifying. I was, and her sister's Emily Blunt. So double mortifying. So she obviously was really, hitting all the high marks of, here's a writer you want to sign. But anyway, at the end of the meeting, she said, so when are you going to be done? And I said, June. And again, not sure I could meet it. And then she said, well, I'm going to sign you today. And I said, should you do that? So she did. It was just the most incredible moment for me, but it had a sort of weird ending. As I left her office, I was so excited and so nervous. You know how you sort of play with stuff in your pocket? Apparently, I dialed emergency services. Yeah, and so I didn't know. I'm just, I'm walking to the tube, and then my phone rang, and I said, hello, and they said, this is emergency services. What is your emergency? You've called us 3 times. And I went, oh, I got an agent. And they said, okay, that does not qualify. Please turn off your phone.
I'm still thinking words on the page. Emily, Felicity's working off of words on the page. I mean, an agent knows when an agent knows. And Portia is not the only person in this audience who's wondering, how does it feel to have such great success on your first book?
Well, it's really surreal to this day. I didn't expect any of it. I had written a different book. The book got rejected 98 times. So I had no expectations going into this. When Felicity told me she was going to try to take the book to Frankfurt, where they introduce books to agents, to publishers and to editors, the night before she took the book to Frankfurt, actually took the book, it was COVID, when she zoomed in to Frankfurt, she called me and she said, look, lots of books never get picked up. Your book may not get picked up. A lot of people whose books never find a publisher. This might be your fate. And I said, okay, I know. And I'm really glad she said that. So I had no expectation. But then she called me 24 hours later and she said, oh, cancel all of that. Forget I said any of that. Yeah.
I heard some of those stories, actually, before the book got published and before it was brought to market in the U.S., and I was like, that's going to be a thing. Who do I have to stalk? And luckily, your U.S. editor is someone that I stalk quite frequently.
Oh, good.
So
yes. Well, Lee would be a good one to stalk.
It was really easy. What's it like to turn around and see a wall of your books?
Okay, this is the first time I've seen the paperback. Thanks, Todd. No, it's absolutely stunning. I think it's beautiful. I didn't know that it was going to be so shining and so cool. So I love it. I absolutely love it.
I'm really pleased. You guys like it, yeah? Yeah, it's really good looking. Also, just so you know, there's extra stuff in our edition, and I'm not going to spoil it for you. I know what it is, but I'm not talking about it here because it's special, and I'm very pleased that we have it. If Elizabeth, you know what? Hold on. Do you ever want to host, or did you ever want to host a cooking show yourself?
This is a sad fact about me. I hate to cook. And so when I was working on this book and my husband said, what's your book about? I said, it's about a woman chemist who has a cooking show. He said, no. That's not good. And I said, but see, copywriters never write what they know, so that's okay. But so I had to do research on cooking. And, as you notice, there aren't really many she doesn't cook that much. She does. She cooks, but she's not telling you so much about recipes or anything. And I had to learn about cooking. I'm more of an eater. I love people who cook. I respect people who cook. I make myself available for dinners whenever somebody else wants to cook for me. I'm very lucky to have 2 kids and a husband who really cook well, but I do not. I often serve a meal and say, we should have gone out. It's not something I do well.
I grew up with stories of Julia Child. This was sort of the heyday of PBS, and she would occasionally drop an entire chicken on the floor and then just pick it up and say, well, that's fine. We can just wash it off. Okay. My godfather, everyone, it was constant Julia Child everywhere. So that was, for me, part of the fun of Elizabeth was just also being able to dip back into sort of a nostalgia that was more entertaining than not.
I had never seen Julia Child.
Well,
I never watched a cooking show. I just don't.
I get that. I do. It's just Julia Child on WGBH in Boston.
yeah.
There was no escaping.
Oh, wow.
And I say that respectfully, but there was no way you were going to escape it. But speaking of television and cooks, were you satisfied with the television series adaptation?
Well, as my producers say, remember, it's an adaptation. It is not meant to be the book.
Right.
And that's exactly right.
Mm-hmm, yep.
But I will say, everybody I worked with was great. And the thing about having a book taken to Hollywood, I got a lot of great advice. The minute that book was signed, I don't know how this happened, but the word went out, and a lot of famous authors wrote me and said, we have some advice for you. And the advice was, hand over your book and then do run the other way as fast as you can. And it was really good advice because, you are handing over your child to other people and they're going to raise it differently. And that's just the way it is. But, I'm really lucky to have gotten to work with the people I worked with, and I'm really lucky to have learned exactly how Hollywood works, which is, when you're writing a book, you're alone in a room. Well, Hollywood has 5,000 people working on that book, and everybody has something to contribute. And so I went out at one point, and I just, overall I thought, well, I could not work in that kind of environment where absolutely everybody is going to say, I think it should be done this way or that way. So for me, it was really good to back away. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Elizabeth knows her audience, though, man. She really knows who she's speaking to. And I feel like you knew who your audience was, even though I know the story of the creation of this world and Elizabeth and everything else. And it was not quite designed with an audience in mind per se, but I really feel like we were all in it together. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering what you've learned 3 years later from all of your readers, because we're talking millions and millions of readers. And I'm just wondering what you've learned from them.
Well, I've had the privilege of traveling all over the world to talk about this book. And what I have learned is that there isn't a woman in the world that doesn't believe that she's in the same boat as Elizabeth Zott. It is really interesting to me to get to go to places where you don't expect to have a lot of people say, this is still my life. That's the lab I work in right now. How are we going to change this? About 2 or 3 weeks ago was Women's International Day, and I spoke to a group of 15-year-old Muslim girls, and they were fantastic. And so what they wanted to know was, how would Elizabeth Zott deal with the pressures that women have today and the way that things are sliding back? This is in the UK. I talked to these girls sliding backwards. They're also sliding backwards in the UK. And this one young 15-year-old girl says, Bonnie, we can't really wait for the people who are in power now to fix things. We have to act now. And I went, you're 15. Are you available for the presidency? I mean, it was, and I think that's been some of the most amazing things. The other thing is that in Korea and Turkey, I was asked the same question. In Korea, it came up, are all these characters Korean? And I said, oh, well, absolutely, they can be. Because what I was trying to do was write universal characters. And then when I went to Turkey, I got the same question, are all the characters Turkish? Because they're so Turkish. And it made me realize, the book is about our commonalities. And how much we share. And all over the world, people say the same thing. We really need to improve things. We all want the same things. We all want safety and happiness and all of this stuff. But why are we still fighting over things like this? So one of the things I've been talking about lately is including science education at a much younger age. And I'm talking about 4 years old. Because if we started teaching chemistry specifically at age 4, that entire generation would be raised to understand that there is absolutely no point in racism or sexism, because chemically that's impossible. You cannot judge people on their race or their gender, anything like that. And you learn that very quickly in chemistry, which was great for me because that meant that everyone Elizabeth Zott worked with knew very well that women aren't inferior and never have been. Never have been. We have never been the weaker sex. So I really think as I go around the world and I hear people talking about the book and what we can do, I've been so inspired. I'm really inspired by young people who talk about it all the time. It was adopted into a bunch of boys' schools, so I hear from 15-year-old boys all the time. And one sent me a really great email over Christmas saying, I'm giving the book to my girlfriend, but I wondered if you would read my letter to her, because I want it to be right. And it was just the greatest thing. He goes, I'm trying to be Calvin, by the way. So
Wait, he's hoping to hold grudges? I love that.
Yeah.
Sorry, I do love that touch about Calvin where it's just like he held grudges.
It's a grudge.
I'm like,
Yeah.
I think I've met that dude.
Yeah. So I don't know. These kids have been great. And I had one boy in particular. You know how the teachers have kids write the author. So this one kid writes me and he goes, Dear Bonnie Garmus, thank you for writing Lessons in Chemistry. It was way better than Lord of the Flies.
I'm going to sit here for a second with that. I mean, I don't disagree, but I am having a moment of, wow. Kid's not wrong, but wow.
I know.
That's a comp I wasn't really expecting.
Yeah.
And, when you're a bookseller, you do think in comps, and I was like, we might have to steal that for really. 15-year-old in Europe says, better than Lord of the Flies. I don't know. That's kind of fun. Yeah. What's next? Can we talk about the thing that you're working on, or are we still deep in this book?
I don't really talk about.
Okay.
But I was actually forced to talk about it.
I'm not going to force you to.
Oh, no. But okay, what happened was somebody asked me about the next book and I started explaining it. And this was a while back. This was 2 years ago. And now I realize that everything I told that person, a huge group of people, was a lie because it's no longer about that. But then I had the incredible honor to meet the Queen of England. And she says, what's your next book about? And I said, I don't really talk about it. And she said, but to me you will. And so I did. I told her the whole plot and everything, and she's like, And so whenever people say, what's your next book about? I say, you just need to ask the Queen. She knows the whole thing.
Who has a Ouija board? Someone has to have a Ouija board. I just want to make sure that I'm also... Is there a lesson to take away from Elizabeth's journey?
Well, I think the big lesson is we're all going to be faced with tremendous troubles. And we're all going to be pushed into certain corners and told who we are or who we can be or whatever. And I think Elizabeth Zott's favorite word is no. You have the power to say no. The most important thing is to speak up. Never hesitate to speak up. I know it can be hard, but that is the only way to make change. And when you speak up, you give someone else power in that room to speak up with you. So I think that for me is the big takeaway from her.
I mean, what I love, or part of what I love about Elizabeth is this world changing that she does for other people simply because she's just Elizabeth. And she's very clear that she's Elizabeth. And it's rare that we get to meet someone like that at all, let alone in the pages of a book, because sometimes there's a tendency to gloss a little bit. We're not glossing Elizabeth in any way. Oh, no, she is who she is, which I'm delighted by. But you guys know what I'm talking about, right? Yeah, I see those heads going.
Well, she was meant to be, chemically speaking, she's the catalyst of the book. Every person she comes in contact with, she changes. And so each of those people change. But does Elizabeth change? No, she doesn't, because from the get-go, she knows who she is and what she's about. And when I wrote her, I was writing my own role model, and I hope to live up to her expectations someday.
Wait, so did you base her on a female scientist, or
No.
were you just writing your own? That's what I thought.
Yeah.
Okay. Just making sure I'm getting through everything. Okay, we're not doing a sequel, are we? There are lots of folks who want to know what's going on with MAD.
Yeah, I know. You know what? I wrote a book that actually Elizabeth Zott was in, my very first attempt at a novel. I never finished that novel, but Elizabeth Zott was in there for 3 sentences. But that book, that started with MAD. She was the protagonist, and there's something mysterious about Elizabeth Zott and what happened to her. And I dropped it because that book was going nowhere. But I sometimes think after I finish this other book that I'd like to go back and find out. I know what happens to MAD because I know. And I think that would be a great story to bring forward, but I'm not doing it now.
That's fair.
Yeah.
We can be patient. We can sit quietly in the corner. There are books to be read.
Okay.
I promise.
Lord of the Flies.
I'm not sure I need to reread that. And I did actually promise a writer that I would finish Middlemarch by an event on April 10th. And I will tell you, I am in section 3, and I am making much faster progress than I expected. What are you reading and loving now?
I just finished Rachel Joyce's new book. It's called The Homemade God, and I really loved it. Rachel Joyce is a British writer, and she wrote The Unlikely Pilgrimage of Harold Fry, which she actually wrote the movie for as well. She's a great writer. I really enjoyed that. And then I've read, of course, I saw a bunch of books on your table that I've recently read. I really enjoyed The Ministry of Time, and also a book called Butter, which is a book by a Japanese writer. It's a feminist book about, it's based on a true story of a serial killer who kills men by feeding them. True story.
It's a trade paperback original, and I promise you we have a lot of copies. It was a Discover pick in November. So I would be remiss if I didn't mention that we have lots of copies. And there's the air conditioner, so we might use that actually as time. So much background noise. I do have one more question, but I'm not going to ask it because I don't want to spoil something, and I am going to ask you separately.
Okay.
Quietly, because I would like everyone here to have a chance to get their books signed and ask their questions of Bonnie and keep them spoiler free, I hope. Yeah? Maybe? Kind of? Okay. Paramus, thank you so much for joining us. Bonnie Garmus, I'm
Thank
so
you,
happy we
Miwa.
got to do this
Thank
again.
you.
I'm so happy.
Oh, thank you.
So, hey, give us just a second to set up the signing part.